Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Polititeam Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ray Hennessy, and today we're joined with Dr. Christabel Devadoss. Dr. Devadoss, could you please tell me a bit about yourself and what exactly it is that you do?
Yeah, it's Christabel Devadoss. Sorry.
Oh, I'm
No,
so
you're all
sorry.
you're all good. I was just telling you, everybody
Oh,
does that. It's totally fine. Like even growing up, like people actually never said my last name right. So, because I think I mentioned, or I don't know if I mentioned this, but I grew up actually in rural Ashtabula County in rural Ohio.
mhm.
So like our last name is Devadoss, but everybody actually said Devadoss when I was growing up. So totally fine.
My
No,
apologies
all good.
entirely. Devadoss.
It's
All right.
spelled it's
Could you?
spelled like it looks like it's Devados. So
Mhm.
it's yeah, totally fine pronunciation.
Well, it's especially tough because where I grew up, there was a girl in Emily, and her name was Devadov, and it was spelled almost the
Yeah.
exact same way, except for the N being an OV. So I'm
No,
sorry.
it's fine. So like in South India, so Devadas was my grandfather's first name, which became like our last name, and it was actually spelled
Mhm.
Devdas. But then when they came to the
Oh,
United States, they're also South Indian Christian, so there's like changes in spelling that way. But they came to the United States, they spelled it this way. Um, and so Devadas is the pronunciation, but it is spelled like Devados or Devadas.
right. Okay. There you go. Then on that note, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what you primarily focus on?
Yeah, so I am a political geographer. I teach at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm in the Department of Political and Global Affairs. My research actually has changed over the years. First focused on like Indian identity in the United States and what that kind of looked like in terms of the diaspora. I've looked at a lot of different things, photography. I used to be a professional photographer before I went into academia, and so I've looked at like the role of like colonialism and settler colonialism in landscape photography. And that had me looking obviously at rural areas. And then now my research really has shifted to focusing on the rural Rust Belt and the narrative surrounding that. Um, a little bit about why I was interested in that is that I grew up in rural Ohio after 9/11. My mother was from Ohio and my father was from South India. And so that kind of was just like an interesting perspective growing up. And then as I saw media coverage, especially post 2016, I just felt like a lot of things weren't necessarily being discussed, or, it's hard because those narratives can be sort of like totalizing narratives, and there's a lot of nuance in those areas, I think, that doesn't get covered. So that's sort of where my research has focused lately.
And how did you get into like the field of research, academia? Like, what was that journey into all of this?
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Yeah, do you want the long version or the short version?
Whatever you think's appropriate.
Yeah, I went to school for um, journalism, visual journalism, at Kent State University, which wasn't initially how that went. I guess I went to community college, then I went to another university, and then I ended up at Kent, and then I went into journalism. But I actually ended up working as a photographer. I went into wedding photography, and worked in the Cleveland area for many years, doing like Photoshop and running studios and photographing weddings and portraits. I was always interested in landscape photography, so I did that on the side. And yeah, I don't know. I just decided I was going to go for a master's one day, and I took a geography class. And I was like, no, this is what I'm going to do. And so I went for a master's, and then I went on for a PhD while still working kind of part time in photography. And yeah, I was interested in, yeah, identity. I was interested in understanding sort of the global impacts on the local. So all this stuff was, what geography covered, and that's kind of how I got into academia. And then I got lucky when I graduated and got a job because it's very hard to get jobs, in academia. And so, yeah, it's really just a lot of luck.
Interesting. And I think it's very interesting that you can see throughout your research papers kind of like your history of photography. I thought one thing that was really cool when I was looking through your research papers, the use of actual photography. When I'm a student here in college right now, I have to read a lot of research papers, and quite frankly, a lot of them are just paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and basically no, how do you put, like, tangible imagery I can like relate things to. And it's really hard, especially on topics of like global warming and stuff like that, because you could say an area increased by 5 degrees, 4 degrees, but it's not there in the head. But when I see a picture, for example, of, I know on your website there's a slider you have of I think it was like the ice sheets, and when you slide it, it shows like the amount of snow and ice like receding over time from the same area
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and stuff like that. Yeah, I think stuff like that really addresses the point and makes it a lot more memorable than just dropping some statistics or some pure research on paper. So I would like to ask, combining photography with your research, how has that worked? How has that synthesis worked for you?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there's a lot of different areas in which I've done that, but I don't always do it. So I do like, this very text-based research that
Right.
is kind of required of academia. But then when I'm doing projects like that you talked about, that's actually just some side project I did for a class, for a class to try to,
Oh, really?
make education a little bit more interactive. And that was like an example, that story map I came up with was kind of to help students think about when they're doing research projects, like how we can think visually, not just like textually, because it's really important to get information across to public audiences. And I feel like sometimes in academia that's very difficult. It's something that isn't really being done as much as it should be. And especially it's increasingly important now. And so even right now, I'm actually teaching a course. It's called Multimedia Research. And that's kind of what we're doing. We're like thinking about ways to talk about academic concepts that are really abstract and like how to present them in different ways, like visually through podcasts, like some students like to use podcasts, like you all are doing, which is really cool. Video, so many different ways to use visuals. Um, and I haven't actually done that in the research I think that you're going to talk to me about now. So the first step was I just did the research, interviewing people and all that. But I do believe and hope that I can continue doing this and kind of merging the photography and sort of documentary aspect to this research so that it can reach more public audiences, I guess.
Right. And I think, right before we talk about the research papers exact, like, in specific, why do you think that historically the academia has been very focused on just like kind of textual, I don't know, it's like it's kind of like a conservative style, like one way of academics, which is like a research paper, just follow the format writing. Why do you think academics kind of has a hard time branching out to like a multimedia focus?
I think that's a uh, very interesting question. I think there are a lot of reasons, and my answer may not be correct. I mean, I'm sure there are things that I'm not even thinking of. But I think it's very hard to change like a system, that's kind of been in place for so long. It's not
Hmm.
that faculty or researchers necessarily wouldn't want to do something different, but it's kind of a system that rewards you for publications. How many publications have you gotten? What are the
Hmm.
journal metrics, right? So the things that you're rewarded for, so that you get tenure, so that you can get jobs that have security, so that you're not in precarious positions where you're teaching part-time or adjunct or whatnot, reward you for publishing in certain journals with certain metrics, and those are text-based. And they haven't changed over time because that's just the way the system kind of has worked. I do think
Hmm.
that some universities and some sort of there are initiatives for people to be more public facing and proactive about things, and so I think that is changing a little bit, but it's really hard to know how that will kind of go in the future. But I do think it's just been something that people have just done for so long, and it's hard to change things. that have existed that way.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And with that, I want to talk about a few of the papers that we look through. The first one is the from Jamestown to Bethlehem, local connections of geopolitical violence.
Okay, yeah.
Which, firstly, for the viewers, if you could give a little bit of what that paper was about. I don't want to mischaracterize or missummarize anything. So.
Yeah, that was, I mean, that does connect to kind of the rural sort of Rust Belt as well.
Mhm.
That came from an academic delegation that I was on, and I won't get into too many details about that, but yeah, it was just really, people tend to think of, geopolitical violence as something that's far removed from the places where we live. Like when people think about Jamestown, Pennsylvania, they don't think about, the West Bank, or they don't think about Bethlehem, or they don't think about, because why would they? What does that have to do
Mhm.
with someplace on the other side of the world? And so that paper was really about bringing those connections together. And yeah, like if people were to read the paper, the idea is you're in this refugee camp, across the world, and there are connections, direct connections to uh, a small town in the rural Rust Belt, because
Mhm.
Combined Technical Systems is the manufacturer for the some of the rubber bullets. I didn't confirm. I can't remember exactly. Sorry, but definitely the tear gas
That's all
canisters.
right.
If you pick them up, um, they're connected. They were manufactured in the United States, right? So
Mhm.
um, when I was there, we were walking around. There is evidence that, the IDF had been tear gassing children, video evidence. You see the sort of the bullets, the rubber bullets, the tear gas canisters across the refugee camp. And yeah, I had a moment where I picked up a one of the tear gas canisters, and I saw where it was manufactured, and it said Jamestown, PA. And that was a moment that was pretty shocking just for me as someone who had grown up in that area, because I used to go there to see fireworks as a kid for 4th of July. And that was like a really just shocking moment, and I think that, yeah, no one in Jamestown, PA that I know, or anyone even in the neighboring counties has any idea that that's going on, right? Like no one, you don't think
Mhm.
about that when you think about Jamestown, PA. You think about, Pymatooning, which is a lake there, and like fireworks or like whatever else is going on there.
Mhm. Yeah, it does seem shocking looking into kind of how, I guess, surprisingly interconnected everything is, and how, in a sense, you can find how really, I don't know how to put this, that there is really no area that's truly cut off, in a sense, where even in the most surprising ways, you'll find kind of the cultural, productive, and social residues in the most far out areas. Especially, I think it was especially interesting looking at some of the photography that you included within the article, um, with the especially the use. I don't know why. I just thought it was very interesting when you include the imagery of, when you include pictures of flags, um, for example, religious signs along, freaking rural Ohio and Pennsylvania. I wouldn't think in Ohio and Pennsylvania they would have flags of Israel up, or they wouldn't have flags of uh, just, how do I put this? When you think of the rural America, you think of white Christian America.
Yeah.
You don't really think of anything else. And this is a subject that you talk about in another paper of yours, a really big focus about kind of expanding this kind of narrative of just white rural America, and that there are large minority groups within those regions, and they're very important to the culture and the identity of that. And what it goes to show is that a lot of these rural areas, well, they're actually a lot more interconnected, a lot more diverse than what it may seem. Um, if you're able to go a little bit into that, how actually rural America is a lot more than what many people think it just is.
Yeah. So when we talk about rural America, I mean, and then the I do want to say like different parts of rural America, right? Like vary. So,
Right.
rural America in the South is, very different than rural America, maybe in the Midwest versus rural America, in the Southwest and so on. And so when thinking about the what we call the Rust Belt, particularly, I think that it has been stereotyped, across the political spectrum as, yeah, white, Christian, you know, I mean that is, red leaning. And while those stereotypes, there is definitely, I'm not saying that there is no truth in that because, those areas are majority, according to the census, definitely majority white. Um, in the last election, obviously they vote, most of these places voted very much Republican. But I also think that there's a danger in making those sort of sweeping generalizations because it kind of feeds into that narrative. Like we're defining this region this way, and therefore this is what this region becomes in a sense. Um,
Like a self-fulfilling like prophecy in a sense.
well, not even that, but just if you tell someone or you tell people for so long, like this is what you are, it's almost like this is kind of what we become. Um,
Mm,
but that's more philosophical. It's not something you can necessarily prove or say, but there are parts of the United States that are, rural areas that aren't majority white. 20% of rural Americans identified as people of color, or it might have been 24%. I had the statistic. I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly. I put it in the
it's fine. It's fine.
paper, but I mean, it's a significant number. And so I think that's something that we should focus on. And even in areas where people are majority white, we know that census data is not always accurate because it tends to undercount people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people. Um, the issues with the 2020 census were numerous, including like the fears over the citizenship question. A lot of people didn't fill out the census. I mean, I know people who did not fill out the census who are people of color, you know? And so I think, relying on that data is important, but it's also, we have to kind of understand that it's not always accurate. And even despite that, even if let's say only 5% or, 9% of a population is made up of people, who aren't white, that's still worth like understanding, right? That's still something that we should talk about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And you know, even if it was 9 10, that's a significant. That's 1 in 10.
Yeah.
That is a significant part. Rural America, like you said, is really big. Has a large population, so you have to keep accounting an account of all these people. I thought it was really interesting the cultural impacts of living as a minority in rural America. I know the paper starts off with a biracial Korean American. The father is white and the mother is Korean, and because of that, however, because of the environment that person grows up in, there's kind of like this tension of kind of the culture, the racial elements, like what it exactly means to be a non-white person in rural America. And I was wondering kind of you can go into kind of that struggle and maybe because part of it is like this whole labeling of white America of rural America is white, it leads to a bit of this like kind of identity struggle in a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assessment. I think that, um, and again, there are two papers that I kind of talk about this, both covering different aspects. There was the one talking about just, I tried to identify the issues that rural Americans face, like as people of color that don't get covered by major outlets. And then there was another one I just recently did on sort of the geopolitical impacts, on how we see sort of the broader U.S. Geopolitics or geopolitical stances manifest in rural towns, and I think that yeah, you see that as is, and with most of the people I interviewed, there is a real struggle with identity and what that means and how you fit into spaces. and it varies. So like for some people, their experiences are not they're not all going to be the same, right? Because people of color have different experiences. So if somebody is a person of color who say is Middle Eastern or South Asian or whatnot and lives in a rural area after 9/11, their experiences are going to be very different than someone who might be Korean American living in rural America after 2020 or after COVID, or um, anyone who was living as a Black American after, the Civil Rights Movement or after George Floyd. So it's just, there's so much nuance, even within those sort of groups. But it is worth talking about that these experiences, rarely are part of that sort of broader dialogue. So, for example, I think the article you're talking about, I mentioned that one of the people that I interviewed, and several of the people I interviewed in this town, talked about how the Washington Post came and interviewed people about the impacts of the Trump administration post 2016. And to the people I interviewed, everyone that was interviewed was white. They didn't interview anyone that was, an who brought in any kind of like identity or how that impacted them. So we didn't see that they didn't interview any, Black residents. And so that was kind of striking to some of the people that I interviewed, because they were saying like, hey, we actually are really impacted by some of these policies and some of the rhetoric that's coming out of this administration, and nobody wants to hear from us. And I think that's an important point, and so that's kind of what I was trying to get at in that article, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. And I'm interested in the Rust Belt mainly because of the kind of consequences of deindustrialization. Like I look at it from like an economical lens. The deindustrialization really hurt a lot of communities, especially a lot of non-white minority communities, especially the African American community in certain areas. I know, like for example, Gary, Indiana, was especially harmful for the African American community when its manufacturing plants were shut down, and that's kind of common for a lot of the country. How the area just has not never recovered, and it kind of became this. At least in my view, I don't know how you view it, but it's like this kind of. It became this neglected region of America, the entirety of it, where it was viewed as kind of. It was what gave it life was supposed to be this bygone technology, coal mining and all these rural towns. That's past America. We're moving forward towards a different, more, I guess, Neapolitan, cosmopolitan America. And I'm curious to hear your view on it. What kind of does it feel like the rest of the country is trying to move away from, kind of distance itself from that kind of identity, that kind of life? And do you feel like maybe that kind of community is, I mean, you can make the argument that maybe Trump is trying to bring more life into and kind of rejuvenate it, depending on how you view it. But a lot of rural America is, this is a criticism I hear for the Democrats, for the Democrats. They're kind of not giving these people a voice and kind of purposely trying to go past it for a more cosmopolitan view of America.
Yeah, I don't know if I have like I think there are a lot of answers and people will have differing opinions, but just as someone, who grew up there, yeah, there are a lot of struggles that rural people face. And I understand, yeah, the criticism, like I said in the article, it's, both sides of the political spectrum talk about rural areas in the same way. The right was using it kind of as a identity politics, as they criticize the left all the time, like, oh, identity politics, this is what, Democrats or, the left or the liberals focus on. But if you think about East Palestine, for example, that became such a war about specifically white identity, and conservative outlets were telling people that it was a war against white people, that the area is nothing but white people that live there, and all these different things. Well, that's not true. There are a lot of people of color that live there. Um, but then, it's, I would
But
say, the
Sorry,
other,
could I
okay,
just ask?
yeah.
I'm a little curious, because I never heard this view of like East Palestine becoming a bit of like a white identity kind of struggle. Could you go a bit more into that? Like this is a new kind of lens for me, hearing about this.
Okay, yeah. So I got into it because the reason I was kind of focusing on this, and I didn't necessarily write about this in academia, but so if you remember, there was a film called White Noise. Have you heard it? It was on
Okay,
Netflix.
yes,
I don't know. I
I heard it. I haven't watched it,
Yeah,
to be
it's fine.
honest.
I mean, it's not really the only reason I know about it is because in my hometown, um,
Okay.
they came to film White Noise there, like Netflix, and it was like a
Oh.
big deal for my hometown. Like they redecorated the gas station that had been shut down for years. Like we used to have a gas station when I was growing up, a gas station, a small grocery store, all these different things. Well, they aren't there anymore. There's nothing there. Everything is kind of like moving out. And the gas station had been closed for, I don't know, over a decade. And they came back and they built it back up visually only. Like after the film
Mm,
left, everything is still closed generally. I think the corner store is open, but I don't know, it's not quite the same as when I was a kid. Anyway, so this happened, and there were locals kind of up in working as extras in the film in from East Palestine in my hometown and in Dorset, Ohio. And not even, I think it was like 2 weeks later, it's been a minute now. The incident happened in East Palestine. Well, it was kind of crazy because the film White Noise is actually about like a toxic air event that had happened. So it was really eerie, like the way that it was talking about this, and they're running from this toxic cloud. And I can't remember all of the movie, but it was almost like prophetic in some ways that almost 2 weeks later, like this happens. Um, and so I was following the coverage a lot, just given that I had, personal connections to this. And yeah, there were a lot of people talking about, you know, the Biden administration doesn't care about this place because there's only white people that live here. Or I think I even quoted in one of the articles that even like more sort of middle of the road or media that people would be considered like, or that people would consider as leaning left, also talked about the makeup, right? Like the population makeup, racial makeup of this town. And that just was like a really big focus. But I mean, that shouldn't be the focus, right? And it was more so on the right that like was really honing in on this. But yeah, I think they called it like a war on white people. JD Vance especially used it to talk about like, I mean, I definitely used it as a way to kind of push his campaign. And yeah, it's just there are a lot of things when we talk about rural areas in this way, we lose a lot of nuance. And so national coverage just
mm,
becomes that. Even when I think it was the Washington Post, it was sometime last year, did an article. I could be wrong with maybe a different outlet, but there was some coverage done on the health outcomes, and health disparities, comparing three rural areas in the Rust Belt, and one of them was Ashtabula County, and how those outcomes are worse in Republican-leaning counties. And that's great. That's all true. That all that data is out there. Um, but I think one of the things that's not mentioned, regardless of what the political kind of affiliation or leaning is that those outcomes are far worse for people of color, especially for like Black Americans and Indigenous Americans in some of these areas, and in Ashtabula County especially. And so I think that's what
mm,
the narratives sort of miss. So in the research, when I talk to people, um, I mean, there are just, in addition to all the other things that rural residents face, which is, lack of infrastructure. I mean, internet access is really poor, declining, yeah, not just infrastructure, but lack of access to like food, to grocery stores. Like all of these things are real problems. But when you are a person of color, you face all of those things, and then you also face all these other challenges, right? Like discrimination, active
mhm.
discrimination. I mean, hate crimes, um, discrimination in employment, um, just so many things that just kind of get swept under the rug. if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would assume because they get swept under the rug and they're not discussed, it's kind of hard to get like real, statistics and really know exactly to what extent it's going on. It's kind of like a silent violence in a sense.
Yeah, and I don't think any of it's like necessarily nefarious. It's not like people are, saying, "Oh, we're just going to cover this up." It's just it's such a small group of people that, but it isn't. I guess my argument first is that it's actually probably bigger than what people think. It's just that we don't have the data and we don't always have the statistics, um, to really get into that. And then the second is like people don't always want to talk about stuff, um, because it in a small town, if you start talking about the things that you're facing, like people might know. That's why I'm being very kind of broad. You you don't want people to know that you are talking about something because it's a small community. People will know who you are and they may be able to identify you. Um, I can tell you, like, out of the people I interviewed, people talked about isolation, microaggressions, definitely discrimination in employment, racial, ethnic profiling, concerns for safety, well-being, verbal harassment. Some people actually had like serious psychological trauma, discrimination in schools, really overall just like feelings of not belonging, voter discrimination. That was definitely one. Um, Divisions in families, and I think this is where when we talk about like geopolitics and the political impacts of like the United States and the geopolitical positions it takes, um, they have impacts intimately on people's everyday lives. So like your position on COVID or whatever, if you're, Asian American living in, rural Ohio, your family, if you're biracial, or if you happen to have like friends or family that believe or that were calling it, the China virus or whatever it is that Trump was saying, or saying it's the fault of Asian people, or vandalizing, you know, um, Thai restaurants, or whatever it is that's going on, like you're feeling those impacts and knowing that like your family or your friends support those things. I mean, that's a real kind of trauma that you experience. Um, like, I don't know, who do you have to talk about it to? It's very isolating.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Kind of, if you live in a more like a densely populated city, for example, there's a lot of groups or associations you can meet with people more like you and converse and kind of help one another. But if you live in a rural America and there's it's either hard to because of the infrastructure, it's hard to meet up with other people. It's hard to kind of have these groups and associations. Like I can see that being very lonesome for those who don't fit like the general mold of the rest of the town. Uh, One thing you brought up earlier that I thought was really interesting was when you were talking about your hometown and talking about how like in certain other areas like infrastructure is declining and such. It's kind of like this idea of like your hometown kind of eroding away before your eyes. When I think of my hometown, for example, I live in New Jersey, but um, I see how my hometown is changing. It's going through a period of immense changing. A lot of places are being basically demolished and changed, and at least for me, I guess it's kind of like they're being built back up, but just very, very differently. But what kind of impacts are there seeing maybe the place you grew up in, kind of in a sense, I don't know, decay, I don't know if decay is the right word, but kind of go away in a sense.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say because I have seen the changes over time. I definitely think those areas, and again, this is me speaking personally, but also kind of relying on the people I interviewed in different areas that, not in my hometown necessarily, but in other rural areas from people I don't know who had similar kind of ideas. But there is a lot of that. I think there was always sort of, there are these periods of time, I think, that are worth noting that I talked about that people noticed that it was harder to sort of live in those areas, after 9/11 or after these sort of political events or broader geopolitical events globally, because that sort of rhetoric and those things kind of manifest in these rural towns or rural areas. I mean, they manifest everywhere, not just rural towns, like in urban areas as well. Like, for example, we tend to think of rural areas as being, yeah, like homogenous in certain ways, but actually urban areas are sometimes more segregated than rural areas. So this discussion of like rural versus urban is sort of um, I would say it's much more nuanced. It's not as like sort of clear cut because you can find that sort of infrastructure decline in urban areas as well, right? It's not just rural areas. Um, but yeah, there is definitely a lot of that. It's very hard too because given the rise of like disinformation and social media, I think people sometimes have a hard time understanding or like I wouldn't say understanding, but the sort of information that's coming in. Like if you were to go when I lived in rural areas, you go to the dentist office, you go to the doctor's office, you go wherever, you're only seeing like Fox News or and now you're probably only seeing like OAN or some of these news networks that aren't necessarily like we used to have sort of partisan divides before, but now it's like much more hyper partisan, I guess. And with OAN, it's like the reliability is very low or questionable. And so this is what people are kind of seeing. And I think that's sort of when there are opportunities to, like, even let's say right now with the cut, sorry, it's just like a hard, complicated topic, trying to get a good example
No,
here.
no, no. Of course, take your time, like answering it.
Like, even with the cuts going on, for example, there is like people when they tend to think of themselves in places, they don't always think of themselves as like, hey, I'm like living in an area that's disadvantaged in some way. Um, for example, there was a local art center that was basically getting funding from the federal government, part of the arts community for being an underserved community. A lot of people in that county or that area didn't realize that that is an underserved area, right? They're not thinking about themselves as being underserved or economically challenged, even though they know that to be the case. When you're thinking about broader federal programs, you're thinking, I don't need that. We don't need that in our town because we don't need handouts. We don't need like these kinds of things. Not knowing that you're already kind of benefiting from those things, or you should be benefiting if you're not. And those are ways to kind of like, bring back development, bring back a community that is, thriving. And when you're thinking about like anti-DEIB across the country, people don't think about how DEIB helps, veterans or, all these things that are located in these counties and that, having it benefits like everybody, right? Like equity is something that everybody needs. It benefits everyone, but not everyone knows that or believes that, especially in these areas. And so there's just this really, really hard push against it, and I think that conservative outlets have been able to sort of leverage that, and they realize like this is a way to continue to divide people in these areas instead of like allowing them to build community. Because like when you have grassroots community movements, for example, in Ohio, how abortion was protected, right? Issue one last year in 2023. Sorry, it was 2023. That was protected because of a grassroots movement. And places like Ashtabula County that voted red, voted for Donald Trump, voted overwhelmingly to protect abortion in Ohio's constitution. They also voted to overwhelmingly make marijuana legal. Like these are like sort of democratic initiatives. So it's just like you know what I mean? There's like so much nuance in this that we're missing by like having these like totalizing narratives about places. I don't know if that answers your
And
question. Sorry
I
that
think
I went on a
this.
lot of different tangents.
No, no, no. It's fine. It's fine. And I guess it also goes to show how really these communities are ever changing their views, their forms. Maybe they're in some ways they're maybe not as conservative as one may think they are. or at least, classic Republican conservative is one way to put it. They might not necessarily fit that perfect mold that you think.
Yes, yeah. And I did find the statistic I meant to tell you. It's 24%. It's 24% of rural Americans,
24%.
according to the 2020 census, identified as people of color.
And you think that might be like underrepresenting slightly because there's a lot of people who don't respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be. I think it depends on the area. Like, again, it's hard to make totalizing narratives about places because it just depends on where you are. But I would say, like, the data that we have and sort of the information that we have suggests that, yeah, people of color are, especially in the 2020 census, were underrepresented. Um,
And I think oh yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. And I think with that, because I think we're coming close on time, I would like to kind of like, take a step back and just when focusing on rural America, like how does talking about stories of non-white groups, of minority groups, help kind of when focusing on all of rural America?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it changes the conversation, and I don't know if it helps. Let me just say that. I mean, I don't know what helps. I don't have any answers. Sometimes I look at the world and I'm like, I don't know how to help anyone. I don't I think that there are answers. I think that there's nothing wrong with like getting more information about things, right? There's nothing wrong with making things more complicated because the world is complicated. And, politicians in areas, especially rural areas, like to sell things as like this is black and white. Or because people like to hear things as if they're simple, right? It's like an easy way for humans to process information. But the reality is like nothing is simple. Everything is super complicated. And the more we recognize that and the more data we have and the more we like talk to people and the more empathy we have for people, um, I think, and critical thinking, right? I think these are things that help when we talk about rural areas. And these are things that can benefit people. Again, like I was saying, with equity, people are very convinced right now that equity is bad somehow, but it benefits people, it benefits everyone. Um, and like going back to I did remember exactly what I was talking about in the East Palestine example. There's just so much stereotyping. There was people were saying that I think it was that a bunch of the outlets were saying, oh well, the Biden administration would have responded faster if this was a primarily black area. Or Donald Trump Jr. had said, like, if people of East Palestine, Ohio, pretend they're Palestinians from the Middle East, the Biden administration would pay more attention to them. Like, these were things that were being said, right? It's like, there's so much going on there. You have someone saying that, and yet you also have in those rural areas, like, for example, politicians um, in from Ashtabula County supported hearing the perspective of the Nazis in the Holocaust, right? Like this made national headlines. So you have all this different stuff going on, right? Like sort of
Mm-hmm.
anti-Palestinian, but also like anti-Semitic. And so they're all like converging in this hodgepodge of like, I don't even know. I don't even know what to call it. But I think the first step is recognizing that, yeah, these areas are nuanced. A lot of different people live there, people of color, people who are progressive, um, you know, gay people, queer people, trans people. Like these people live in rural areas and they're not just white, heterosexual, Christian, you know, whatever the stereotypes are. Um, so I don't know if that helps or answers your question.
No, that was great. And I think with that, Dr. Devadoss, thank you for coming on to the Police Podcast and appreciate this talk. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience that's listening.